Good afternoon, everybody.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. My
It's
dog,
okay.
I have to put her up.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's virtual webinar, The Underground Railroad Routes Through the North Country. So my name is Elena Millette. I'm a planner at the Tug Hill Commission, and I'm your host for this second webinar in our three-part webinar series on abolition and the Underground Railroad. So this series, we had one already and one more coming up at the end of the month. And right now we're here with Jackie to talk about places, people involved in abolition work and routes taken by freedom seekers. And specifically, Jackie's topic today will be highlighting the laws and policies that have driven and continue to drive freedom seekers northward. So for those who may not know, the Tug Hill region covers 2,100 square miles and portions of Jefferson, Lewis, Oneida, and Oswego counties. Our commission is a small non-regulatory state agency, and we provide technical assistance in land use planning, community and economic development, and natural resource management. But more recently, we've been partnering with other organizations and individuals to highlight history on Tug Hill. So if you haven't had a chance, I highly recommend visiting the Commission's YouTube channel, and hopefully you're finding this video there. And you can see some other series that we've done, such as Letters from a Tug Hill Logger, and you can see a previous webinar from this series called Rise and Fall of the Florence Settlement. And I'll add a link into the description for everyone to find those. And so I'd like to take this moment to introduce today's speaker, Jackie Madison. So Jacqueline Madison retired from Pfizer, Wyeth in 2010 as a principal toxicology information specialist for drug safety and has degrees in chemistry and library and information management. She's a veteran of Vietnam, and her husband is retired from the military. And they both have two daughters. Jackie's also a Rotarian and an avid reader, grows grapes, makes wine, and recently started restoring old trunks, which is a very fun hobby to get involved in. Jackie is the president of the North Country Underground Railroad Historical Association, and that oversees the North Star Underground Railroad Museum, which is celebrating its 10th year of programming this fall. Her biggest contribution to the organization as president was back in June 2019, acquiring a building that houses a museum in Ausable Chasm here in New York. In October of 2019, Jackie had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to visit a site that was an African-American community composed of formerly enslaved people and fugitives escaping slavery in St. Armand, Quebec. So currently, Jackie's working on a book on the Underground Railroad in the Adirondack and North Country area, and I speak for myself, and I'm sure many others. We're very much looking forward to reading that. And so if you're interested in volunteering at the museum, the association is looking for docent volunteers to act as guides for visitors in the museum. And what a docent will do is, or a volunteer will do, is open up the facility. They serve as guides for visitors, answer phones, pick up mail, manage the gift shop area. They also partner with a trained docent and receive specific training for those duties. So as you can see, Jackie and her colleagues are very passionate about the Underground Railroad history and have a wealth of knowledge to share with us today. So we appreciate you making the time for us, Jackie. I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Alana, for that wonderful bio. Today, we will talk about the Lake Champlain Underground Railroad, the impact of the laws, the people affected, and the routes used. I just want to first show you, the Underground Railroad Museum to ask you to attend if you have a chance. It is near the Sable Chasm resort area, and we are open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, 10 until 4 in the evening. So please come by. We are requesting that individuals make an appointment, but if you are unable to do so, there are some walk-in appointments. So with that, I'll move on to my presentation. Slavery in America was a system designed to provide settlers with free labor. The New World needed to be prepared for the Europeans, and using an ethnic group that was physically opposite in appearance from the American settlers as that workforce fit this design very well. Variations on free or low-cost labor has been used not only with African Americans, but Chinese, Hispanics, American natives, and other groups that had recognizable physical or cultural differences from Europeans. The laws used were designed to restrict their movement and keep workers in place. As a result, many African Americans spent most of their lives confined on the property of their owners. The Underground Railroad was a system designed to aid African Americans out of slavery into freedom. It was America's first attempt through abolitionists to give individuals that had been enslaved a chance to be citizens. While the exact number of freedom seekers will never be known, it is estimated that by 1850, nearly 100,000 people had escaped via this route. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses, not a train, and it was active from 1850 until the Civil War. Although enslaved African Americans escaped prior to this time period, these terms were not a part of those escapes. One story of the earliest use of these terms was in 1831, when Tice Davis escaped from Kentucky into Ohio, and his owner blamed an Underground Railroad for helping Davis to escape. The terms first appeared in The Liberator, a newspaper by William Lord Garrison, the founder of the abolition movement, on October 14, 1842. Individuals who made it to New York via this system had the option of going west to the Buffalo area, and you can see that as you move across here, east into Vermont, or going north into the Lake Champlain area. For those individuals that took the route through Lake Champlain from New York's side, they would have made their way from the Albany, Troy area and passed through Ticonderoga into Westport, Keysville, Peru, to Champlain, Rouse's Point, then into Canada. Taking this route on the eastern side of the lake in Vermont, they would have moved up to Charlotte, Burlington, and Swanton areas. In this area, they would have encountered abolitionists in both of these. This is a sort of a good map to see. This is the map that we've used at our museum to sort of give you some ideas. This was not just a land route. This was also a water route that people would take, because there were canal boats that they would use to ferret fugitives to Canada. Two of the abolitionists in this area that I will talk about today is Stephen Key Smith and Noadiah Moore. Smith, in 1837, chaired the organizational committee at the initial meeting of the West Peru Anti-Slavery Society and was elected treasurer. Stephen later in life said he may have spent about $1,000 or more helping fugitives during the 20 years preceding the Civil War. If he spent an average of $2.50 per fugitive, he helped at least 400 individuals. Stephen wrote a poem, The Slave's Prayer, which voiced his feelings. In 1894, when he died, his obituary said, and I quote, "He has many times housed, fed, and at midnight carried the fugitive slave on his way northward to his Canada home," end quote. Stephen also supported the rights of women and said that women would not endure taxation without representation. And I can say that the suffrage movement was sort of born out of the abolitionist movement, and they were entwined. His former home has a documented hiding room, which is in the third barn behind the house. The room was a root cellar. He would take fugitive slaves to the Moore's house in Champlain during the night. On your left is actually the home that he lived in at the time. It's still about the same as it was when he was there, except it is missing the kitchen in the back. It burned down. And on your right is actually the hiding place. And it is a room, a fairly large size room that you can walk into. Noadiah Moore, another abolitionist in this area, lived in Champlain, about 7 miles from the border. Stephen Key Smith credits Moore with getting him involved in the underground movement. Moore would take freedom seekers to Canada when they arrived at his station and find them places to stay and work. In fact, he owned a lumber factory in Lacoil, Canada, and sometimes they would work for him. While this country was founded on freedom, it would become wealthy on the blood of individuals who would be denied that freedom. New York had slave codes. The first one passing in 1702, then another in 1712 and 1730. The latter two had major expansions to the first one, which was the 1702. These codes allowed owners to punish slaves as they saw fit, limited their ability to meet with others, and to being off their owner's property. And they could also only testify against other enslaved persons. The 1712 code prevented free Blacks from owning land and required that owners who freed a slave were required to pay 200 pounds. That was in 1712. In 1730, the code didn't allow slaves to own weapons or be out at night unless they were with their owners. And you can see there were other things. Slaves in 1712, if they were found guilty of major felonies, they could be put to death. They prohibited free Blacks from owning property. And so it was really a way of controlling these individuals to ensure that that labor force would be available. The federal government also ensured slavery would be a part of America by including the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution. It stated that no person held to service or labor would be released from bondage in the event they escaped to a free state. This addition was added to the Constitution because Southern politicians were concerned that free states would be a safe haven for runaways, since by 1787, many Northern states had abolished slavery. New York, though, did not abolish it until 1827. But Southerners still felt this clause wasn't sufficient. And in 1793, the Second Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. It was similar to the Fugitive Slave Clause, but had more details on how the law was to be put in practice. It allowed owners of enslaved people and their agents to search for escapees within the borders of free states. Owners had to provide proof of ownership if runaway was caught, which was usually a signed affidavit. Anyone who helped a runaway would have to pay a fine of $500. As a result of the 1793 Act, some abolitionists organized resistant groups and built complex networks of safe houses to aid enslaved people. Many northern states intentionally neglected to enforce the law. Southern politicians kept the pressure on runaway slaves until Congress passed a revised Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. This act required citizens to assist with the capture of runaways and denied enslaved people the right to a jury trial. The penalty for interfering with the capture or assisting a runaway was $1,000 and 6 months in jail. To ensure the statute was enforced, individual cases were handled by federal commissioners who were paid more for returning a suspected runaway than for freeing them. This act was met with more resistance than the 1793, and the Underground Railroad reached its peak in the 1850s. Now, who were these freedom seekers? What made them flee the only place they had known as home and venture into an unknown one? While those helping formerly enslaved individuals were a key factor in the fight for ending slavery, it still required enslaved individuals to make the movement viable. They were not typical field hands, although some field hands did run away, but oftentimes skilled workers whose fathers may have been their owners. Freedom seekers tended to be well-dressed, and some of them could pass as white. Moses Roper fit that description. He was born in Caswell County, North Carolina, about 1850, on a day and in a month he never knew. He was the son of an enslaved woman named Nancy, who was part African and Indian, but mostly white. His father, Henry Roper, was the plantation owner. When he was about 6 or 7 years old, Moses and his mother were sold to different masters. He was subsequently resold several times. He ran away repeatedly, but he was always captured and punished. Finally, in 1834, he escaped from Savannah, Georgia, on a ship which was headed for New York. After regaining his health from cholera, Roper took a steamboat to Albany, where he hired out as a steward on an Erie Canal boat. Feeling increasingly unsafe after traveling 350 miles west, he returned to Albany and headed for Vermont. In the Green Mountain State, Roper worked as a field hand until he saw a newspaper advertisement for his capture. His fear of capture in 1835 made him flee the United States for Great Britain, where he published his narrative in 1837, gave hundreds of lectures there, obtained a formal education, and married an Englishwoman from Bristol. Her name was Anne Stevens Price. In 1844, they sailed for Canada and made Canada their home. While many freedom seekers may have been able to assimilate into their new surroundings, there would have been those whose physical characteristics stood out. Although well educated, this was true of another who came through our area. Samuel Ward was an imposing man with a baritone voice, and he was 6.5 feet tall. Ward's parents escaped to New Jersey from Maryland in 1820 when he was 3 years old. However, he did not learn he had been born into bondage until he was an adult. Fearing slave catchers, his parents moved to New York City, where they raised Samuel as if he had been born free. Samuel became a congregational minister, which led to pastorships in Poughkeepsie and Cortland, New York. Ward often felt the sting of colored prejudice. In 1840, he experienced a striking example of Jim Crow. While passing through the Mohawk Valley toward Binghamton, where he was scheduled to present a lecture, Ward escorted a white lady fugitive who was on her way to Canada. Her complexion was so fair, she was accepted by the other white ladies in the railroad cars from Albany to Utica and westward. And I quote, "No one suspected that she was not as respectable as the best of them," end quote. To his irate Binghamton audience, Ward exclaimed, and I quote, "I was, of course, obliged to take my seat in the Negro car," end quote. By 1851, Ward and his wife had decided to move to Canada, as he was now in danger of being arrested for violating the Fugitive Slave Act. A few months after Ward escaped to the Queen's dominions, he greeted his wife and 3 children in their adopted country. He was outraged when his wife told him the captain of the boat on which they traveled had refused to seat them anywhere save on the deck. Ward actually was a man of some means. He had monetary means, and they would have been able to pay for a cabin. Ward became active with the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada, and in 1853, the society sent him to Great Britain. His anti-slavery lectures drew responsive crowds. In 1855, he published his life story, Autobiography of a Fugitive Slave, Negro, but he eventually ends up in the Caribbean islands, and that becomes his home and where he is buried today. While the Fugitive Slave Act caused African Americans to flee bondage for a life of freedom, at first in the northern states and finally in Canada, in the 1880s, laws against Chinese and East Asians would emerge that would push them to return to America. The Underground Railroad is a 2-way highway. More than 60 years after the freedom seekers, conductors on the Chinese Underground Railroad took this route and risked imprisonment because their activities earned them huge amounts of money. This migration was the result of laws put in place to keep Chinese out of the United States. The first one was the Page Act of 1875, named after Horace Page, a California Republican. It was intended to end cheap Chinese labor and immoral Chinese women, and bar immigrants who were labeled as undesirables. Undesirables were defined as East Asians. Anyone bringing a person from China, Japan, or any East Asian country to the United States without their consent and seeking their services could be fined $2,000 and receive a maximum jail sentence of 1 year. The ban was strictly enforced for Chinese women and became a barrier to all East Asian women trying to immigrate to the US. The Page Act of 1875 created the policing of immigrants around sexuality and eventually extended to every immigrant that wanted to enter America. It remains a primary immigration restriction per some scholars. The act was America's way of protecting the social ideals of marriage and morality, which was caused with the initial influx of Chinese immigrants to America. Males who arrived as part of the California Gold Rush borrowed money from brokers for their trip here and paid it back with interest. This left them with little money to bring their wives to the United States and resulted in a prostitution industry amongst them. Laws directed at Chinese female immigrants emerged, although prostitution was in the American West with all nationalities. In addition, coolies, which are really the cheap labor, and female prostitutes were believed to be a part of a slavery system, a touchy subject because involuntary servitude had been abolished in 1865. The American Medical Association believed that Chinese immigrants carried diseases that would kill whites if they were exposed to them. This fear was amplified with Chinese women, who many believed were prostitutes that easily transmitted these diseases. The Page Act of 1875 marked the end of open borders. The 15th Passenger Bill of 1879 was the first bill to significantly curtail Chinese migration. This bill only allows sea vessels to bring a maximum of 15 Chinese passengers in any single voyage. A sworn list of all Chinese passengers was provided on entry. The penalty for not complying was a $100 fine and 6 months in prison. President Rutherford Hayes, though, vetoed the bill as it violated the terms of the Burlingame Treaty, which established formal friendly relations between the two nations. The U.S. granted China the status of most favored nation with regards to trade under this treaty. Hayes asked that the bill be modified in agreement with China. It effectively lifted any formal restriction to immigration in the United States from China, resulting in large-scale immigration from China. 7 years later, the Page I Act of 1875 and the 15th Passenger Bill of 1879 set the stage for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This act prohibited all immigration of Chinese labor. It is considered to be the most significant law restricting immigration into this country. At the time, the nation's population was composed of only 0.002%, that's 2,000th Chinese. Congress passed the Exclusion Act to placate worker demands and assuage prevalent concerns around white racial purity. Signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882, Chinese Americans challenged the act, claiming it was discriminatory, but their efforts failed. The Exclusion Act spurred later movements for immigration restrictions against other undesirable groups, such as Middle Easterners, Hindu and East Indians, and the Japanese, with the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924. Just as the fugitive slave laws failed to keep African Americans from running away, these acts did not keep Chinese from coming into the United States. In fact, so many were coming through the Lake Champlain area that the jails would fill up along the way. So a jail to hold them was built in Port Henry. And this jail eventually would hold over 600 detainees. Any persons aiding Chinese to falsify records could be fined up to $1,000 and be jailed up to 5 years. Just as we have border patrols today, there were Chinese inspectors to help control the influx of people. It was more than 60 years later, in December 1943, when the Exclusion Act was repealed. The display that you're looking at contained one of 2 police logbooks from Port Henry that has a brief bio with a wallet-sized photo of the detainee. Amy Chen, with the Chinese Museum in New York City, actually discovered her grandfather in that book. Bak Yang Chen was born in California, but his parents returned to China. Bak returned to the Western Canada when he was older, and he came across to Montreal with the intent of coming into America. When he came through Rouse's Point, though, he was arrested and ended up in the Port Henry jail. Mr. Chen, though, was able to prove his citizenship and was allowed to stay. He went to New York City and he started a laundry business. Just like with African Americans, the Chinese were a cheap source of labor. I have here 2 pictures. On the left is a political cartoon from 1882. It shows a Chinese man being barred entry to the Golden Gate of Liberty. And the caption reads, and I quote, "We must draw the line somewhere, you know," end quote. On the right is an image of Chinese immigrant workers building the Transcontinental Railroad. It was a government-imposed obligation to serve in the military forces of one's nation that caused the exit of male Americans to Canada and other countries. All men must register for selective service at the age of 18. There were more evaders from America and Australia for the Vietnam War than any other war before or since then. The Dodge drafters and evaders used this area to get into Canada quickly. I know of one individual who chose SUNY Plattsburgh as the school to attend at the time because it was 60 miles from the border. This was the criteria, according to him. He had several brothers and didn't feel that he would be able to get out of going to Vietnam. He also had a cousin who went to Buffalo University and never returned to the US. Draft dodgers were mostly from the middle class and they were well educated. Initially, Canada required drafters to prove that they had been discharged. But in 1969, Ottawa said that immigration officials could not ask about military status if they sought permanent residence in Canada. Draft deserters also used this route. The Dodgers were registered but had not been selected for service. And the deserters were actually active duty personnel that failed to return to their units. They both chose Canada as their haven because they were classified as immigrants. Of approximately 570,000 young men classified as draft offenders, only 750, let me rephrase that, only 8,750 were convicted, and of those, only 3,250 were jailed from that initial 570,000 draft offenders. It's estimated that 30,000 to 100,000 individuals went to Canada, and Canada had more immigrants from America than any other country from 1971 to 1972. In the Vietnam era, I should be going through here. The Vietnam era became unpopular. These are actually expatriates, as they're referred to in Canada, with many American citizens in the latter part of the 1960s, perhaps due to the death rate, and Vietnam was actually the first televised war. Organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society, War Resisters League, the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committees, National Anti-War, Anti-Draft Union, and other groups worked with draft dodgers. Many believe the organization, the resistance, spearheaded the draft resistant movement. Members of this group would burn their draft cards, as you see on your left, or refuse to register for the draft. Just like the abolition movement, not a great deal is known about the draft dodgers and deserters. Either way, those individuals felt it was in their best interest to use the Underground Railroad to exit the US, just like formerly enslaved people did more than 100 years ago, prior to that time. Immigrants today, the routes are taken by freedom seekers that took them in the 19th centuries are still in use today. Due to the harsh stance of the 45th president, it was clear that some individuals were not welcome. Using Roxham Road, located in Locoil, Quebec, on the Canadian side, and near Champlain, New York, on the US side, this road once again becomes a route for those on the Underground Railroad in the 21st century. The US-Canadian Safe Third Country agreement that requires people seeking political asylum in either country to apply to the first country they arrived in. The 45th president took a harsh stance against people coming from the non-European countries, and he signed 3 executive orders shortly after his inauguration. They were Executive Orders 13767, which directed that a wall be built along the Mexican-United States border, 13768, which denied eligibility for federal funding for sanctuary jurisdictions, and 13769, which suspended the United States Refugee Admissions Program and banned travel from 7 African and Middle Eastern countries. The Executive Order 13769 caused immigrant and civil rights advocacy groups in Canada to ask the federal government to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. Some of those groups included Amnesty International, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, and Canadian Council of Refugees. 200 law professors from universities across Canada also agreed. There were other practices that the 45th president allowed that caused some people to flee this country. Those included removing children from their parents, sending immigration and customs enforcement officers, also known as ICE, to factories that hire immigrants who were deported, not extending the temporary protected status of Haitians, among others. So Roxham Road drew asylum seekers and refugees from all over the world. People learned about it via word of mouth or social media. But unlike travelers in the 19th century who journeyed on foot or with a horse and wagon, immigrants today are taking taxi cabs from Plattsburgh, New York, a college town about 30 minutes from Roxham Road. While many in the 1800s seldom came in groups, today there are family units, and you can see one here in this slide. This road became a pivotal turning point for asylum seekers because there is a loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement that allows individuals to take an unofficial port of entry and seek asylum in the second country they entered. In this case, it is Canada. If they went through the official border crossing, they would have to return to the US because that was their first country of entry. Immigrants continued to come through even after the pandemic hit, but were turned around when the border closed. Those arriving after March 2020 are being turned over to ICE, and they end up being deported. From January 2017 to April 2018, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police intercepted over 28,000 people. That number grew to 40,000 by 2019. In August of 2018, we had an intern do a story, and she discovered that there were more than 5,000 individuals that made their way into Canada that month alone. It's estimated that 30,000 to 50,000 immigrants have entered Canada since 2017. Of this number, about 15,000 have received asylum, 12,000 were rejected, and more than 29,000 are still waiting. At this time, that is the end of my talking version. I would like to show a brief film. Thank you, and I'll ask for any questions.
What a wonderful presentation, Jackie. An awful lot of research in there and really interesting that the row it's as relevant today as it was back in the 19th century.
Yeah, it's still sad that we are having people coming through in the 21st century. And it was really booming. And when I was doing the research, I was really surprised to learn that people were still coming through with the pandemic. I thought that sort of put a halt to everything.
Right, especially since the border has been closed since the start of
Yes.
the pandemic, right?
Yeah, we've been closed since March of 2020, and it's not open yet.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we do have some questions actually from our the chat yesterday. And so the first question is, where is the museum? This Ellen said she's lived away from the area since 2009 and is curious to know where it is.
Okay, the address is 1131, but the way I think of going to it is, I know a lot of people know of Sable Chasm, the outdoor resort area, and Route 9. Route 9 used to be one of the major routes to get to the north. In fact, they used to call it before 87, that was the interstate. And people coming up from the city would use that. So if they took Route 9, they would be able to see us. We're right on the hill. You can see the building from the street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll second that. It's really hard to miss. It's right there up on the hill and as you're coming through.
Right. Once you cross a bridge, be on the lookout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I can't speak highly enough of the docents that helped me and my husband when we went there this past weekend. Jim, shout out to him. He did a really great job showing us around the place.
Yeah, it's amazing that we've been able to do this with volunteers. But people will start and then they kind of get hooked. So, which is good. It shows that what was done was really put together well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can attest to that for sure. And I suppose since we're talking about the museum, I guess the question is, do you want to share anything about the 10-year anniversary?
Yes,
Maybe any
yes, I would.
milestones you guys have had.
We opened in 2011, May of 2011, and this is our 10th year as a museum. And we really would like people to come up. We have a tentative date. It will be in September, so I won't give you the exact date until they're finally decided. It will either be the 18th or the 19th. I know it's one of those 2 days. And we are hoping that people will come up, visit, but also there will be a program. They are in the process of putting that together right now to sort of showcase what has emerged over those 10 years.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're definitely interested to hear more about it because it's an awful lot of years, and I'm sure you guys have had some really great milestones along the way.
We've I think though getting this sculpture was probably I don't know, it just happened right on time.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and the video you showed of the sculpture there at the end, it's really powerful, and the plaque you have that's describing it is really it's a really moving piece, and I'm glad you guys have that.
Yes.
To share. So our next question is from Joe. He says, was the North Country Underground Railroad widely traveled? Which I believe you spoke an awful lot about in your presentation, but I'll let you maybe expand on some things you've said.
Oh, on the routes that it was it was used quite a bit. I can say that Roxham Road seems to be one of the major roads that people take to go into Canada. That's because it's not your traditional border crossing. And it's sort of like a little gap that you can sort of go over into Canada. When the immigrants today were coming through, at one point in late 2017 into 2018 and beginning of 2019, they actually had a tent city on that side, on the Canadian side, because they had so many coming through, they couldn't process them fast enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard about it even before your presentation. So yeah, it's still alive and well, the route is, and people.
Route. And they use trains. One of the individuals I did not talk about, I thought about it, was Lavinia Bell. She was actually, you may know the story of Solomon Northward, 12 years a slave. Lavinia Bell was, her family was free in the DC area. And she actually was kidnapped from there. And she ended up in Texas, a slave on a farm. And she escaped. You know, at first when she was on the farm as a little girl, she was sort of an entertainment piece. They taught her how to sing and dance, and she could imitate animal sounds. But when she got older, they put her in the fields, and her and her husband would run away. Her husband never made it out because he was so severely beaten when he was caught, he died. But she eventually made her way out, actually pregnant one time when she escaped, but was caught and sent back. But she eventually gets out, and she makes her way through Rouse's Point area here. And there was a gentleman that actually paid her train route into Canada. She was seen by a physician there, and she had all these scars from her punishment. And one of the scars that she had was on the bottom of her feet. That's because her owner would make her stand on a flax hackle. And a flax hackle is just a large piece of wood with large nails that are pounded through it. And so she would have to stand on these points, nail points. And so the physician actually wrote an article in the Montreal Gazette about the scars on her body. She had had a finger cut. She had been branded. And about a month or so, a month and a half, maybe 2 months later, she disappears, just like Solomon Northup disappeared when he went for a book talk.
Yeah, and those things you can see in the museum, the flax,
that flax hackle.
The flax hackle, and hear her story reenacted, right,
Yes.
in that film, and it is very impactful, and you know, it definitely weighs heavy on you.
Yes, it really is very sad.
Joe also asked, what was there a station? So I guess, and he has station in quotations, knowing that it's not, you know, like a railroad station stop, but can you
not a station, but we have a hiding place. I guess that could be like a station.
Right.
We do have individuals coming looking for a train, and they use trains, but that wasn't their sole source of getting around. You know, Frederick Douglass was able to escape by a train and impersonating, I guess, the seaman. But you know, if you're thinking of where there's places, we do have Stephen Key Smith. That's why I included him. That is a documented, authentic hiding place. We do have reference to that because Smith did his memoirs later in life.
So we can say that, I guess, being consistent with the metaphor of the Underground Railroad stations were really hiding places, and they were people's homes. They could have been barns. They could have been a lot of things.
Yeah, they could. Some people would be in the attic. Sometimes that was a hiding place. There were some people who were crafty enough to create little mini rooms inside their walls. So wherever they could shield them is where they would put them.
Yeah, and and his last question was, what was the typical final destination? I know you spoke a bit about Canada, but are there any other destinations?
Yes, actually, we have, you saw the John Thomas story, I'm sure.
Mhm.
Not everyone ended up in Canada. John Thomas was one of those. He actually stayed in the area in Franklin County, and he became a prominent community member in that area. He had a rather lengthy obituary in the Malone newspaper when he passed. And he was given property too. We had Timbuktu. I know people may know about that, near the John Brown site. Timbuktu was actually created with the help of Garrett Smith, who was a wealthy abolitionist from Peterborough area. And him and John Brown were friends. And John Brown wanted to create this community for African Americans, and he was giving away 40 acres of land to men because Black men needed land worth $250 to vote.
Mhm.
And that's where Timbuktu came about.
Right. The first webinar in our series spoke to the Florence Settlement, which was a settlement of freed men and women which was created in Oneida County. But like you said, that with the Fugitive Slave Act, that land, it wasn't really safe for them to be there anymore, and so they found new homes.
Yes, yes. Well, with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was the harshest, and and a lot of what we call today bounty hunters went after people to bring them back.
Mhm. We had a question in our registration asking, what do we know of any locations or any homes or tunnels that are still in place and that were used during the Underground Railroad operation? And then we know now that it's still alive, but I guess they're probably wondering more about maybe historical homes that had been used during the 1800s, 1850s.
We have reference to some, we just don't have documentation to prove it completely. We do know that there's a place called the Arthur House that is behind the Masonic Chapel in Keysville. There is a hiding place. There is a tunnel there, but I don't think the owner is able to do too much with it at this time.
Mhm. Yeah, we've heard at the commission, some people sharing potential sites in the 4 counties that we work in. And, some of them have been confirmed and some of them haven't. And, it's definitely a process to go through doing that. And I believe we have a contact, Jen, that has information about where to go in case you believe your home is a Underground Railroad operation. Correct?
Is that like a state level type thing?
That I'm not sure of.
Yeah, well, we'll share that information with you, Jackie.
Yeah.
Okay.
We look back in our emails.
Okay.
And well, I'm thinking if there's any other questions. I don't see any more in our registration, and there wasn't any more in the chat. I'm not sure, Jen, did you have any questions you wanted to share?
No, I've thoroughly enjoyed the presentation and learning every time I hear a speaker. It's fascinating. So thank you.
Yes, and I'll say if anyone who watches our video is interested in learning more, what resources would you recommend for them, Jackie?
Well, there's Tom Calarco. He did a book, the Underground Railroad in this area. But if you look for Tom Calarco, you can certainly get a lot of details on things that were taking place here. I have a lot. Don and Tom also did a book, but that really is for the New York City area. I hadn't really thought of this one when you asked me that question, so you caught me a little off guard here.
It's okay. No worries. There's so many archives, I think, and we had our first presenters in the series going through old newspapers and seeing what was said in abolitionist papers and kind of tracking the movement that way and different key stakeholders and players in the movement. So there's definitely a lot of research to be done and a lot more stories to be told, and I'm glad that you had a chance to share some of them today, and I'm hoping people get a chance to look into it themselves.
I hope so too. Like I said, it was really quite interesting when we learned about the Chinese component. That was I was really fascinated with that too. The fact that we had people coming back into the U.S. Was really showing. And then the Amy Chin, when she was up here and she stopped and she discovered her grandfather. And as a result, she actually has digitized both of those books. So they're online. And I think the last I spoke with her, she had actually found, I think maybe about a half a dozen other individuals from other, not from her family, but from other Chinese American families. So I think that was really neat. We do a podcast, and I almost forgot it until I thought about Amy Chin. We have a podcast online as well. We've done 2, and Amy Chin was our second podcast. And if anyone's interested in learning more about the Chinese connections in the U.S., that would be a great one to listen to.
That's a great recommendation, Jackie. I hadn't heard of it, so we'll look it up and we'll put that in the description for the video as well.
Okay, thank you.
And it makes you think too, just all of the, descendants who are alive today of freedom seekers and all the stories that are still have yet to be told. So I hope that those stories get elevated.
Yes, I hope so too. Thank you. I want to thank you and Jennifer for allowing me to push some of this information out. I think the more it's known, the more people can learn and understand and maybe share it with others.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. It's the word's got to get out, and our honor to host you. So I'll end our recording and thank all of our listeners for tuning in, and thank you, Jackie, so much for making the time. And if you want to hang on, we can chat after.
Okay.
Thank you all for tuning in today. I'd like to share one other opportunity for you to join the webinar series, the very last in this specific series, titled A Well-Perfected Organization, the Underground Railroad in Oneida County, New York. And you can register for that still. It's still live. And right here, you've got the link to it, but you can also go to tughill.org/upcoming workshops. And there you'll also see a link to the upcoming webinars, including the Well-Perfected Organization.